Well, hello everyone, and welcome to episode 57 of Yorkshire Gamers Elite Big War Games podcast. And no surprises today, it is the second part of the Jutland epic, where I sat down with Nick Jellicoe, grandson of the Admiral of the British Fleet, John Jellicoe. And in the first part, we talked about Nick himself and his career and his father as well. And then we moved on and we did kind of a prelude to the Battle of Jutland and talked about the various characters involved and the build up to the battle. Today, we're going to talk about the battle itself, surprise, surprise, and that forms the main part of this interview. And we go through all the different phases of the battle and have a good discussion on the technical aspects of it and the history of it and how that history has been spoken about. And then, very short section at the end, we just talk about the aftermath of the battle and what happened to John Jellicoe post Jutland. There is a bit of a technical issue at the end, and I've had to cut a section out because my part didn't record, but Nick's did, and the gap was too big to put it all together. But I won't spoil your enjoyment, I don't think, but I wanted to make sure that I got the little bit in at the end about John Jellicoe being in New Zealand and, of course, being buried at Westminster Abbey. So sit back and get yourself a cup of tea and enjoy this second part of our Jutland interview. Without further ado, here's the interview. Well, welcome back, everyone, and we're going to talk about Jutland, the battle now, and it's something that's been talked about and examined in extreme detail over many, many years in many, many books. And I would like to recommend to everyone before we start that Nick has done an animation that goes through the battle. And even for somebody like me who lives and breathes this sort of stuff, it was fantastic, and I really enjoyed it. And it's a very good visual way of understanding what happened I think it's 24 minutes long, something like 24,
It's
25 minutes
exactly
long. Is
24
that
minutes.
right?
Yeah, yeah,
20,
yeah.
24 minutes long. So if I'm not going to guarantee that me and Nick are going to cover the battle in 24 minutes. The way that we've been going, I don't think we will. Neither of us are.
I think we go
Neither
on
of us
till
are.
we feel.
Till we're done. Yeah, we're fine. So, but that 24 minutes is a really good way of getting your head around what happened, and especially the animations and the pictures of the way the fleets move. So give that a watch. It's available on
Oh,
YouTube and
you
also
like
on.
the Harry Potter effect.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
It's also on www.jutland1916.com, which is Nick's main website for all things Jutland. So, 1916, we've talked a little bit about what policies are and what plans are, and we've got two different ideas from the different sides about how they want ideally this battle to go. So if I'm correct in saying that the British are trying to draw out and defeat the Germans, whereas the Germans are trying to, aware of the discrepancy in numbers, draw out sections of the British fleet, defeat those sections to bring numbers to parity. Is that kind of where we are at the start?
Yes, absolutely. I think the British intention was to try and get an engagement in the northernmost parts of the North Sea, so that German destroyer fuel might be exhausted as much as possible. Whereas I think the Germans were trying to get an engagement in the southernmost part, so that they could have full performance and reserves. But as you say, whittle down the numbers so that they could actually, at some point, think that they might actually have a full fleet action. Jutland was never meant to be a full fleet action. It was meant to be a trap for a battle cruiser group.
And those, we've talked about those characters, and maybe Jellicoe is the right person to be in charge of the British, because with him being, if Beatty would have been in charge, maybe he could have sent smaller units off and been susceptible to a sheer taking, 6 or 7 dreadnoughts out with his entire fleet. Whereas I think Jellicoe's more of a character, as we've described, who would keep everything together, take less risks, and therefore less chance of
I think he believed,
overall defeat.
very strongly in the sort of idea of, you want to concentrate your forces as much as possible, make the Grand Fleet work as a
Mm,
single unit rather than disparate units which could be encircled and whittled down and attacked in that way. Yeah, so I think they had very, very different points of view on the day.
yeah. So it's a bit of, I think it's a bit of vague intelligence, isn't it, that kind of sets the British out from
Well,
their course.
yes, I mean, the British interception, direction finding interception of German signals was actually exceptionally good from Room 40. Problem is, Room 40 didn't go far beyond intersection and decipherment. It didn't go into intelligence analysis,
Right.
and operate and produce operational intelligence. They knew there was a sortie because the signals that would have been involved in making sure that certain points of egress had been cleared. So they knew a sortie was coming. They misunderstood, or at least one person in room 40 asked the wrong questions about
Right.
the call signs for the German flagship, and the call sign had DK is still in port. DK was the
Right.
flagship's call sign while in port, but in fact had
Right.
actually gone to sea. So when the fleets actually did meet, both Jellicoe and Beatty were totally dismayed, and Beatty's reaction was, "Well, how do you expect me to sort of trust intelligence if this is what you've given us? Because we had no warning of this. We were actually led to believe quite the opposite."
We've got so on the British side, we've got a huge movement of ships. 151 British ships are involved. We have Jellicoe leaving Scarpa. We have Beatty leaving Rosyth. And then there's another, and I do apologise, I can't remember the
No,
name
I
of
know.
the other admiral who comes from
Is it
Cromarty with the
Jerem
eight.
or something like that? Might be Jerem. I can't remember.
Yeah,
My knowledge has gone
yeah.
as well. My memory has gone more correctly.
Is this something that that the Navy has practiced before? This volume of ships out at sea and manoeuvring with that level of number of ships.
That's a good question. Um, yes, but not, I think, in such a short timing span. Because
Mm,
when the Germans had made attempts to lure out the battle cruisers by attacking the sort of the northeastern coast, they'd successfully drawn out the battle cruisers, and the fear was always that the Grand Fleet would just take too long to actually join the engagement. And so that's why some of the ships were moved from Scapa down to Cromarty, being the second
mm.
point of egress. But I think it's safe to say that probably at Jutland itself, that was the first point at which, in the long 40s or whatever it was, such a huge group as 151 actually came together. And the two lines literally physically came together at the deployment.
And I think it's important for the listeners to kind of understand. I mean, if you just want at home to get 151 bits of paper out, all with different names on, and put them in a certain order, it's going to take you a long time. But then imagine doing that whilst you're at sea in poor weather conditions, in poor visibility, with somebody shooting at you. It's remarkable. I mean, obviously, it's the job of the navy, but it's still remarkable to me how you can maneuver that volume of ships without
Yeah, yeah.
crashing into
Well, I
things.
think
And
I think that's the sort of well, I think there's two conclusions from that. One is that many people
mm,
feel that actually a fleet that size is just way beyond the command capabilities of a single officer, and I would think that's close to the mark. Secondly, that a large amount of the critical debate after Jutland revolved around John Jellicoe's meticulous Grand Fleet battle orders, GFBOs, which are regarded and characterized, or caricatured, I would say, as being sort of voluminous and academic and bureaucratic and taking away delegation power and all the rest of it. But going back to what you just said, how do you actually, in that shorter space of time, reliably execute complex maneuvers and complex synchronized maneuvers without having really thought it out carefully beforehand? And that's what the GFBO were, although BT later on reissued them as the Grand Fleet Battle instructions. And that's a nod to Nelson, saying that these were his instructions, his desires, but that admirals are free to, and captains are free to actually take the course of action that they see fit on the day. Very different philosophies here at work.
Just, coming back into the wargaming world, I've refought Jutland on a number of occasions. And I particularly remember one action where I was in charge of the German battle cruisers, and we're only 30 feet away from the other end of the table and the German line and the British. I haven't got a clue what's going on down there. And I'm in a nice warm church hall with tea on tap and not under fire. And I'm struggling to find out what's going on down there. So I think it's we take a lot for granted. I think, and I think we might come.
There is a fog of war. Two of the projects that I had really wanted to try and execute at Jutland and the Centenary were, one was to use the very large map in the National Maritime Museum as being a way that we could actually have a 24-hour war game going on, and have it going on online with a German gaming group challenging a British gaming group, and it being played out on, I think they call it the Mapai Munda or something like that. The other thing was that I got very close to actually having a physical replay with modelers on the Serpentine. And Boris Johnson had actually agreed to do it. And you can imagine sort of saying to everybody, no, if you want to participate, you have to come with your own ship. You have to come in full dress, regalia. So you have to play and just make a tremendous thing about it, and then sort of use pickle cameras to sort of shoot overhead and whatever. Well, the Royal Parks Commission sort of said, no, we can't. We'll disturb the ducks or something. But it could have been fantastic. And in fact, I think the Battle of the Nile had been war gamed on the Serpentine at one time in the early 20th century.
Fantastic. That's the sort of madness that we love on this show.
It was kind of in the Goodwood tradition, sort of Goodwood revival. It would have been fabulous.
Fantastic. So we're out. The British are out at sea, and the Germans do sortie from Wilhelmshaven. Pronunciation not my strong point, so don't get me for that one. We've got Hipper in front, and I think it's 60 miles behind. We've got Shear with the main fleet, and I've had to get my little computer out here. So the British have got 151 ships, 28 dreadnoughts, 9 battle cruisers, 8 armored cruisers, 26 light cruisers, 78 destroyers. And then the Germans have got 16 dreadnoughts, 5 battle cruisers, 6 pre-dreadnoughts, 11 light cruisers, and 61 torpedoes. So there's a discrepancy of a third more for the British in terms of actual ships. But the action itself is pure happenstance.
It's pure happenstance.
There's some poor Danish sailor out earning his living on a steamer in the middle of
there's a little ship called
minding his own
business. Ship called the NJ Fjord, who is sort of,
Yeah.
I don't know, letting off steam
Yeah.
and was motionless. And the
Mm.
reconnaissance wings of both forces, from the British force, it was Galatea and Phaeton, and for the German forces, it was, I think, Elbing with two destroyers.
Mm.
Both went to investigate the plumes of smoke that they saw. And the first shot of the Battle of Jutland was from Elbing, I think from Elbing, actually hitting Galatea but failing to explode. On Galatea was the father of my father's, one of my father's boyhood friends. and,
Wow.
and I'd always wondered what the connection was, but it was because they had a connection from
Yeah.
Galatea. Um, but that was the first engagement. At that point, one ship that you didn't mention, which was, and it was interesting because it's a sort of the forerunner of the carrier war, was Engadine,
Engadine.
which was a
Yeah.
sort of seaplane carrier. It sent up one of its seaplanes, pilot officer Rutland commanding it, and Rutland had seen Hipper's reaction when Hipper turned away, gaining the information that the British battle cruisers were at sea. And so he witnesses this from above and can't get his signals beyond Engadine. They just stop at Engadine. So it's sort of interesting that you know had there been just a little bit more testing, uh, and experimenting with this before, might have been very, very different outcomes. Interestingly, Rutland has sort of, gone from being hero now to the anti-hero. He advised the Japanese Navy on torpedo tactics when they were our allies, and so arguably was quite closely connected to the pre-planning of Pearl Harbor.
Mm.
And then I think there's a biography that's just come out on him, literally in the sort of last 2 or 3 months, which I really were other ones to see.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I've got an interesting side story
Hmm.
about Engadine from our Jutland refight and recreation. And back in 2016, 3D printing wasn't the thing that it is today, and nobody made a model of Engadine. So there I was with 249 ships and no Engadine. And my friend Andy Dickinson, I'll give him a shout out because he helped quite a lot to get the Jutland project on the move. Is a draftsman and CAD architect, and so he designed a, a model of of Engadine, which in those days, 2016, was a remarkably new thing. And he went out and he spent, I think it was 3.5 grand on a
Oh,
3D printer
oh wow!
just to
To be
produce this one ship. So
I'm gonna have to talk to him because I'm actually going through a trying to get a 3D printing project off the ground on something completely different at the moment.
So yeah, so
Amazing.
we always introduce it as the most expensive ship in the British Navy, and everyone will go, "Well, surely Iron Duke with all that." No, no, no. We've had to 3D print this one.
At some point, we'll have to make a kind of connection between you and Reinhard Scheer-Hennings. Reinhard collects all the German ship miniatures and
Oh
has a
wow,
phenomenal collection. There's also another one that you probably know of in the Hamburg Maritime Museum. I'm trying to think of his name. Peter something. He died now. I went behind the scenes and looked at their collections. Amazing, just amazing.
fantastic,
Peter
fantastic.
Tam was his name.
Yeah, right. Excellent, excellent. Thank you for that. So we've got these huge fleets now converging on each other, and we have the development of what's now known as the run to the south and the initial battle cruiser action. But I think it's maybe not forgotten, but it's kind of less well known that BT had his battle cruisers, but he also had a squadron of four
Evan Thomas's
15
Fifth Battle
inch,
Squadron.
yeah,
Yeah,
what we know as fast battleships, super dreadnoughts, 15-inch, the kind of the latest, Gucci kit that
Yep.
the British Navy have. Um, so just talk us through then, Nick, this run to the south and how it develops.
Um, let's see. Beatty reacted instinctively,
Yeah, as
as
we all,
JRJ said he would,
yeah,
which
yeah,
is,
yeah,
hell, let's go after them. So
yeah.
he takes. I think the Germans have five battle cruisers, and he has seven or something like that, and split into two squadrons. Um, he's also, as you say, he has the support, but they're at this point 5 miles behind him. Evan Thomas's
Mm,
three Queen Elizabeth class battleships, which were thought to be the fastest dreadnought on the sea, and then proved not to be as fast as they thought. I think they hit around 24 knots or something. They were 5 miles behind him at this point, but the initial signaling through his flag officer Seymour was faulty for one reason or another. I think sending flag signals or any sort of signals at 5 miles distance in either murky conditions or with heavy smoke is pretty unreliable. And then I think it was compounded by Tiger not relaying signals correctly.
mm,
So the signal never got through to Evan Thomas. Evan Thomas was left there saying, now, do I do I act as an independent fast squadron, or do I
mm,
join Beatty's line? Beatty had intended him to join his line, saying that his general spirit of command was that ships under his command should conform to his movements. But again, not only Beatty, but Jellicoe also had been unclear to Evan Thomas on what they wanted him to do. Beatty
yeah,
certainly didn't meet him, in the week or so that he was in Rosyth before the battle, after Hood's third battle squadron had been sent up to Scapa for gunnery training, and Evan Thomas's ships had been sent south as a replacement. But then nor did Jellicoe, I don't think. I've never been able to really find, and I don't think Jellicoe did either. So I've not found any documentation on that front,
mm,
although they were very close friends.
mm,
The net of it was that as Beatty sped south at somewhere, I think, 28 knots or 27 knots, I mean, they really opened up, was that the gap opened up to something like 10 miles with Evan Thomas before he then decided to actually join and head south. But it really meant that his guns, which ranged something like 24,000 yards, didn't join the fray until Beatty had taken a substantial amount of hits. Part of the problem was a repeat of Dogger Bank, where I think the gunnery allocation was mixed up. So the gunnery allocation was again mixed up at Jutland, and if I remember correctly, Derflinger, uh,
Earthlinger's the one that's left alone,
the
which is
Eisenhund.
probably the most dangerous ship you can
Yeah,
leave on its own.
there's a wonderful. I was come back on Derflinger and Iron Duke. This is a
Mm,
great story between them. But
mm,
Derflinger was left untargeted, and its gunnery officer, who I think was von Hauser, Georg von Hauser,
mm,
literally could just line up his shots very quietly and pick off targets. So that was, failure to concentrate forces, failure to allocate firepower, failure to use the range advantage were three very disadvantageous ways to start an engagement or start an engagement. The British got pounded on the way south. I mean, something like in the total of the run to south and north, Germans managed to land something like 44 hits and the British 17. And most of those 17 were coming from Queen Elizabeth class.
mm.
The British were overshooting by up to a nautical mile over their targets. So they
So
weren't
long ways.
ranging up
Yeah.
to their targets. I think
Mm,
there's a lot of misunderstanding, and I think it's a very complex area. And certainly, I I'm not clear on it, but I think that German ranging of targeting was, if I understand it, a better way of targeting. British tended to
Right.
try and bracket targets.
Hmm.
The Germans walked the fire up to the targets, and so you could see more splash effect as you went forward. And I think the you didn't fire as a whole director from the whole line. You've fired one turret at a time while you were ranging. Um,
And then salvo fire when
and
you've
then
got your range. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
But so there arrives a point after this, after the run to the south, where William Goodenough is actually scouting ahead of the battlecruiser line and spots the German dreadnoughts, Shears dreadnoughts heading north.
Sorry, Nick. Can we just go? Can we just go back just a little bit?
Sure,
Um, we on the animation. There's
yeah,
a wonderful depiction of the ranges and the effective firepower, and we've got the as we've talked about there that
needs a bit
discrepancy
of
between.
correction, by the way,
Yeah,
but
does it? No, let's not tell anyone that. So a lot of the British battle cruisers have got 13.5-inch guns compared to 12 and 11-inch. So there's that let's call it a sweet spot where the British could have fired at the Germans and the Germans couldn't have responded. It, it's a bone of contention. I think there's lots of people have looked at it, but did we? Is there ever a definitive answer of why Beatty didn't open fire earlier, and why it's Hipper that's the one who starts the duel?
I think certainly what I've read is that Beatty was not terribly confident in the accuracy of the battlecruiser fire and didn't want to waste too much ammunition earlier on at a longer range. And that's the one plausible explanation that I can find or remember. But as I say, there was this kind of correspondence between the two where Beatty clearly was more in favor of initial rapid fire rather
Yeah.
than a very slow, methodical targeting and then letting
Mm,
loose rapid fire.
mm. Is there a level of confidence then from Beatty that he can defeat these ships? He's got the numbers.
He's certainly he's very overconfident that he can,
Yeah.
but the gunnery. I mean, Beatty is at a disadvantage here because
Mm,
Rosyth does not have adequate or didn't have adequate practice firing ranges. So the quality of gunnery in the Grand Fleet was vastly superior to that of the battlecruiser fleet. It really, really was. But only because the Grand Fleet did have gunnery ranges in the Pentland Firth that it could more comfortably use without always living in the fear of some sort of submarine attack or what have you. It was only later on that actually adequate defences were brought to Rosyth. And that was after a lot of pushing by both Beatty and Jellicoe to get that done. But even third battle squadron's gunnery improved quite dramatically, I think, when it had gone up to Scapa, and I think that is seen in the gunnery tables that one looks at afterwards.
So, of course, in that that fight, that initial fight, the British suffered two quite considerable, quite important losses and I can never say this right, so do apologise.
Yeah, I'm in the same
Indefatigable.
way.
Yeah,
Indefatigable. it's
who
it's
thought that was a good ship name?
I'm the
um,
same way.
uh,
That
and
was
then
and then Queen Mary.
Queen
26
Mary,
minutes
yeah,
later.
yeah,
Um, Indefatigable is as I mentioned earlier on. I think that it was really Innes McCartney's work
mm,
that identified actually how Indefatigable had died and where she had died, because the famous last picture is not at the moment of her real death. It's she's already a dead ship, and probably everybody on there would have been killed by the concussion waves. and she's missing her whole stern, which had dropped off, I think, something like 600 meters behind. I can't remember the exact number now, but it is a rather horrifying thought and picture to have in mind that this ship actually was just swerving out of the line, out of control as she went down. There's also been a lot of a lot of controversy about the photographs because people have said that they're quite clearly doctored. There's been a lot of doctoring on some of the photographs, that's for sure. But I think Queen Mary's explosion at whatever it is, 26 minutes past, is the horrendous kind of Hiroshima-like mushroom cloud over the sea. It's just, the pictures of this all this sort of almost like toilet roll sort of unfurling in the
Mm.
cloud. It was all the range finding computer printout charts sort of fluttering over the water as she went down. In both cases, the losses are horrendous. I think somewhere around 12, 1300 on each ship. I can't remember the exact numbers now. But on Queen Mary, what was interesting personally for me was that um, I when my nephew was being interviewed by Dimbleby up in Orkney, he was asked. He was sitting next to Nicholas Beattie's son,
Mm.
Evo Beattie, I think his name, if I remember correctly. And
Yeah.
they were both talking about what it meant to be a Jellicoe or a Beattie. And Dimbleby asked the question, and my nephew sort of said, "Actually, I don't think of myself at all as a Jellicoe. I think of myself as a Heber Percy. And when I think of Jutland, we had I think it was a sort of great uncle or something like that, who had been in the water and had surrendered, he'd given up his life jacket to somebody else struggling in the water. He died, the other person did. And it was a very, it's a sort of chilling moment because you suddenly sort of realize, okay, yes, almost everywhere in England was sort of massive deaths were reported
Mm.
in the Manning ports, if you will. But then when you have something like that just come out of the blue in your own family, it was it was extraordinary.
It brings the personal story of
Very.
what is a massive battle that is hard to comprehend. But within that battle, there are individuals on all these ships who've got their individual stories. You
Yeah.
know, where I live in just on the outskirts of Leeds, there's a little old back-to-back terrace just on the other side of the church near where I live. And I did some research, and a stoker from the Black Prince used to live in that house. So that history is all around us. And those personal stories are quite often forgotten in the maelstrom of the whole thing.
Very much, and I think the personal stories are so much more illustrative and so much more engaging and important to use as ways to sort of pass this history on. Because I mean, it really is important that something that happened more than 100 years ago really is regarded as being still alive and still having lessons, and yet feels, I think, to probably is the same way as my generation did at that time, or as our generation did at that time, as being sort of Neolithic history almost. It's been
Mm,
quite
yeah.
incomprehensible. And yet,
Mm,
Jutland to Trafalgar, exactly the same period. And so,
yeah.
it really puts it in context that, how quickly history moves and how soon we forget lessons.
So the loss of Queen Mary was obviously quite a shock. From my reenacting of World War One battles, those are older, inflexible, indomitable, that kind of class of battle cruiser that convincingly defeated the Scharnhorst and Eisenhower down at Coronel.
Yeah.
They're kind of not quite up to being in the battle line with a quite weak belt armor. weak deck armour, whereas Queen Mary is the pinnacle, isn't it, of the battle cruiser. 13.5-inch guns, a lot better armour protection. If you put it next to Derflinger or a similar German ship, you would think comparable. But
I think though,
suddenly it just goes, doesn't it?
yeah, I think though that JRJ often disagreed with Churchill on some naval construction policy, and this was a particular area he disagreed with Churchill. And he said, "Listen, please, we need to get out of." Well, I'm paraphrasing him, but we're obsessed by caliber, and it's not caliber. Some of that it's probably muzzle velocity, which is more important. But it's also that we, unlike the Germans, do not put enough emphasis on the ship as a gunnery platform, on its stability as a platform, on its beam, and particularly on its armor. And yeah, I mean, I think Hood was laid down. I think was laid down at the end of 1916, and we still hadn't really learned those lessons. And then Hood progressively got sort of weighted up and was a completely unstable ship by the time she met her final engagement. It was way too low astern, and her decks were washing at high speed.
Mm. And I think there was a lot of discussion around why Queen Mary blew up for a number of years, and I think we've now come to the conclusion. I think it's widely accepted now that it was ammunition handling that that was the problem.
It was ammunition handling, and we're back to speed of fire. Um, in
Yeah.
order to sort of feed the guns, they took a lot of the cordite, as far as I understand, out of the protection of the out of the ship's protection, and brought them up and stacked them around the turrets and what have you. And
Mm.
it was inevitable that there was clash. I mean, there were people who tried to change this, particularly Lyon's gunnery officer restocked all the ammunition online, but because he found a lot of it was out of date and therefore unstable. But there was also, it's not as binary a discussion as sometimes
Mm.
is put forward, and it's not just Beatty versus Jellicoe. Even I think on Iron Duke, there was quite a bit of discussion about speed of fire, and some of the dreadnought officers, gunnery officers, were still sort of in the same mentality that fire as fast as
Mm.
possible. So it wasn't as clear cut. Certainly after Jutland, the scuttles, Beatty ordered the scuttles to be, reinforced,
Mm.
and they were, I think, sort of redesigned slightly to actually get this point through. So there was sort of an implicit acknowledgement that this had been problematic. But what does it come down to? It comes down to people not following their training, and I think JRJ at the time was kind of probably unwilling to say. Actually, it might have been the fault of some of the
Mm.
guys working in the turrets. And I guess that's where we get all the sort of political nuance of people saying what's appropriate at the
Mm.
time to keep morale up and whatever. You don't want to
Mm.
talk
Yeah.
about your ships having underperforming crews in that moment.
Yeah. Mm. So we then come to the next phase of the battle. We just touched on it before we went on to that little bit of a deep dive about the Queen Mary and the various losses. So the sighting is then of the German fleet coming towards, and the reaction then of Beatty is to turn and go back to.
The reaction is turn to go back north and try and reverse the trap, which he does very successfully. How those orders again were executed or communicated and executed is again a big debate, because Seymour again is accused of not having given the right sort of signals, and Beatty is sort of implicated in that, in the sense that Evan Thomas takes his instructions literally and supposedly turns his ships on this, not only continues south after Beatty's fourth has been
Mm.
deployed back up north and is already steaming north. So Evan Thomas continues south and then turns on the same space. Now, in the animation, I talk about, making the mistake of turning the same spot. So all the German gunners had to do was to aim on the same spot. On reflection, I've heard different things on that. So,
Mm.
maybe uh, that was the wrong conclusion or the wrong thing to have said. But but going north, there's another point of difference, and that is that Evan Thomas maintains that his Queen Elizabeth actually took the stern starboard
Mm.
side to shield the battle cruisers and to fight a running rearguard action,
Mm.
while Beattie's interpretation of this, or his communication of this, is that Evan Thomas's ships were actually to his stern port. I think that it's uh, I think that it's probably the question that actually Evan Thomas deliberately put his ships there, and that
Mm.
Beattie was really loath to admit that Evan Thomas saved his bacon going north.
Because he's taken considerable losses, hasn't he,
Uh,
in losing
Tiger
those two ships?
Tiger has taken 13 hits, Lion about 9.
Yeah,
I mean, both of them are sort of really, really suffering.
and of course, if it wasn't for that turret top lifting off, we could there
The
could have been
ship would have
another
gone.
loss.
The ship would have gone.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so that would have been even more disastrous.
but the action of going north has the desired effect. It leads Hipper and, more importantly, Shear's dreadnoughts up to the north, and Jellicoe is steaming south with the 24 dreadnoughts in whatever it is, six cruising lines. And Jellicoe's is sort of up there. He knows that the firing, he can hear the firing to his south, but he's getting conflicting information. He's got no information really from
Mm.
Beattie, who talks about where the battle cruisers are, but doesn't talk about where the battle ships are, and he doesn't give bearing information that's
Mm.
actually intelligible
Yeah.
for JRJ. Even reports that are coming up from Southampton from Goodenough, who went in as close as something like 4,000 yards to the German line, um,
Brave man.
really, really close to get information. Um, uh, his information is also wrong. So
Mm.
Jellicoe is left with a sort of a really, really risky situation if he, and this is then leads into the whole debate about whether he should have deployed to his starboard or on the center, or as he did to the port. Churchill holds that he should have deployed from the center, but this report was actually written up by one of the doers, and that would have been a super complex maneuver.
Yeah.
Deploying to the starboard, if he got the positioning wrong, would have put him in a position where he was having his own T crossed. I think
Mm.
I personally feel that he had really decided that he would deploy to the port because the likelihood was that, well, not the likelihood, but his objective was to try and put himself and the ground fleet in between Shear's High Seas Fleet and the Danish coast, and that Scheer would have to break through his line to get there.
Mm.
So the allocation of broadside weight in terms of the ships that were how the ships were organized was clearly to the advantage, not clearly to the advantage, but slightly to the advantage of the port side. So I don't
Mm.
think it was necessarily, as has often been kind of portrayed by writers like Arthur Marder, that it was a sort of moment of absolute genius. I think that he actually planned it out that way, and this was a question of, well, are there things there that would dissuade him from doing that?
I think there's that famous. We've got to remember as well that it's not happening on a computer screen where you can see everything.
Yeah.
Jellicoe is acting on limited information. I think there's that famous signal, "Where is the enemy?"
Yep.
Uh, and I and I can imagine that that was translated from "Where is the insert
Yeah.
swear word
Exactly.
enemy?"
Yes.
by the
Yeah. Yeah.
by the signalling officer.
Yep.
So there's I'm not going to say guesswork because guesswork is wrong, but there's a lot of educated speculation going on because Jellicoe just doesn't have the information
Yeah.
to make, as you say. I think you're right. That careful mind, that careful um, way that he has gone through life and plotted things, to have those, cards in his pocket. Right, I'm going to do Plan A or Plan B, and this is going to be the best. I think that's perfectly logical
Mm.
reasoning for that, and that maneuver is quite spectacular, isn't it?
It's
I think it's 5.5 miles long, isn't it? The British battle line.
when it stretches out. I think it's something like
Yeah.
that. And there is, while there's quite a lot of sort of near misses and reversing
Mm.
engines and swerving, there's not a
Swearing.
single there's not a single sinking or collision, which was
Yeah,
quite
it's
incredible.
amazing.
Um,
Mm.
when one is thinking of, six lines of battleships, I think four deep in each one, um, you know, turning to port, being led by what, King George, I think King George the Fifth was
Mm.
was leading, and but then we go into the sort of, the tactics haven't really evolved since Trafalgar in some ways.
Yeah.
There's no independent squadron action. Quite the opposite. The belief is that you gain advantage by concentration, unity, and total, totally working together as one
Mm.
unit and not as individual squadrons.
And that counteracts or um, is the opposite of what the German strategy is, isn't it? You're deliberately making sure that everything stays together, so you're not giving the enemy the opportunity to cut off four ships here or a couple here or there. It's right, lads. We're here. Come and get
Yeah,
us.
within the deployment, then of course there's Arbuthnot takes it into his own hands to try and make a run at one of the scouting group's ships, Wiesbaden,
Wiesbaden, yeah.
that has got caught. It was spotted, and Arbuthnot sees his chance, and I think there's a sort of this. It's funny because I think he and Arbuthnot's wife and my grandmother were close friends. So there's friendship there,
Mm.
but I think that Arbuthnot definitely was just sort of trying to put one on and display this incredible maneuver in front of the whole fleet. Well, he broke through the battle cruiser line, nearly colliding with Lion at one point. Lion had to swerve out of the way to get out of defense's path, and defense was, her munitions blew up at either end. It's funny. I saw defense very closely because we did an ROV over her, and most of her hull is in perfect shape. It's both ends where the munitions were stored, which just blew up. And it's interesting, when Innes and I were involved in sort of making that documentary, we went on Avarov, the Greek Navy's old flagship, like sort of Victory. And Avarov, you could see exactly the sort of layout on Avarov where the munitions were taken out of the safety of the magazines, and would be sort of taken on these sort of rails through the ships and delivered to the guns. It's exactly the same as defense. The casemates were all quite intact. It was just both ends of the magazines just totally destroyed, and another 900 men, blown
Yeah.
up in front of the whole fleet.
And those ships of Arbuthnot are, just for the audience, they're what are known as armored cruisers,
Yeah,
and they are a precursor of even the battle cruisers. So they're fairly low caliber guns, fairly weak armor, fairly slow speed, and then from what I've read, they pumped out rather a lot of smoke
yeah,
from
yeah.
inefficient boilers and etc. So I can't imagine that John Jellicoe was overly impressed to have these huge steaming old wrecks going
Uh,
across the front of his battle line.
no, I should think he was furious at that point. And
Yeah,
even so, I
yeah,
think that the plan had also been that the battle cruisers take up the vanguard by going north of the battle line and going up the port side of the battle line. Beatty took them up on the starboard side and effectively blocked a lot of gunnery right at the beginning. Again, I think both of these actions you have to kind of question: was this vanity or something
mm,
else? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but it clearly was not. It's not helpful. And out of our Arbuthnot's, what, four armor cruisers, uh, three of them, Black Prince ran into the German lines in the middle of the night and got killed. Again, we saw her wreck. Her torpedo tubes were out, so she was definitely fighting as she was going down.
yeah,
And Warrior, which I think had tried to had her rudders. I
mm,
think the ball bearings on her rudders went wrong, and she was just turning in circles and was quite an easy target. She limped home, was hoping to get to Aberdeen, and I think Engadine was towing her, sank. Um,
mm,
so I think the only one was what Duke of Edinburgh that survived.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, which is quite staggering losses from a
Mm.
four ship squadron, isn't it? So we've got the battle line has formed, and then I think it's around 5 to 6. The main fleet action starts. So I just want, if you can, to kind of visualize what John Jellicoe is going through at that moment in time. He's there on the Iron Duke. Does he have, like, if I was, or if we were captain of a ship today, as I said earlier on, we'd have a computer screen with everything laid out. Is he visualizing everything in his head? Does he have a map board? Does he have
You
a
know,
table? How is he visualizing what's going on?
I'm not actually certain. I think there
Hmm.
is a sort of plot chart, but it's not like the sort of computer screens, as you say. It's not like the sort of what one sees on sort of modern day glass charts where people are sort of marking things up in real time or what have you. I think it's a much more laborious process, but I really don't know in detail on this, and that's a gap in my knowledge. But he would have been the center of the line. I've seen, well, there are quite a few photographs hanging around, but there
Hmm.
quite a few photographs from the deployment where one sees the three ships around Iron Duke deploying to port. The visibility is appalling. And I've been on the North Sea in that sort of area, and the visibility can change in 30 seconds.
Hmm.
In one moment you see out 10,000 yards or more, and then the next moment it's down to 2,000. And it is really, it changes so fast. It's interesting. I was just trying to remember what James Goldrick was talking about this, and he was sort of saying that I think in the age of radio, radio telecommunications or more modern communications, officers the tendency is for officers actually to rely more on
Hmm.
decisions being passed down than taking them themselves. It makes a certain amount of sense that you don't want to do
Yeah.
something that is necessarily out of court or wrong. It's far easier just to wait to receive an audio. But I guess one has to kind of question the sort of the issue of delegation here. I personally think that I think there are two major things on which JRJ is criticised in Jutland. One is this issue of well, three major things. One is the issue of delegation, that he was holding the reins too close and too tight and wasn't allowing action to be taken by captains independently.
Mm.
Two, that he lacked really the spirit of aggressive attack. And three, that his decision to turn away was maybe a subset of that, and it was too defensive. And I think, I think the one area where maybe there's more truth than in the other two is on the issue of the sense of attack, aggressive attack. And that's why I sort of say, Scheer was prepared to lose what he had to in order to gain his objectives. Jellicoe, I think, was far more cautious than that, and that's a good and it's a bad thing. But I think on the issue of Turnaway, which we'll talk about in a while, I think it was absolutely the correct decision to have taken. On this genius of the deployment, I think it was in his mind before, and it was in the planning before, and it wasn't a decision of the moment. I think it was much more.
Mm.
Is there anything there that changes his mind?
But it clearly worked, and for that to work, I think he does have to have that overall control of
Hmm.
the individual captains, because we've seen already twice how things go wrong when people act as an individually. We've seen the losses from Beatty.
Yeah.
We've seen Arbuthnot and
He
his.
hasn't seen that though. He hasn't seen that because he was unaware of what was going on with. He was only aware of what was going on with Arbuthnot. Didn't have the information on Indefatigable or Queen Mary.
Mm, mm,
Had he,
but
I'm sure he would have even been more.
it's yeah, it's playing out as he thought it would,
Yeah,
is probably the better way of
yeah,
putting
yeah.
it, even if he's not got the direct knowledge. And we've then got this classic classic naval term of crossing the T,
Mm.
and that's where your line of ships can bring its broadside onto play for a unit or a fleet coming towards it nose on, which can then only fire with limited gunpower. And of course, this is the reverse of Trafalgar, isn't it? Because
Yes, he
Nelson was
broke
going
through.
towards the sea. Yeah,
I think
he was the maverick.
Nelson's genius at Trafalgar for me was really exploiting the fact that he wasn't facing a unified command. He was
Mm,
facing Spanish and French ships that didn't really know how to talk to each other, had never really trained with
yeah.
each other. He was also fighting with the knowledge that he was only employing, I don't know, 35% or something of British frontline, main British
Mm,
frontline power, and that the speed of engagement and the circumstances of engagement were very favorable. Bright sunshine. You approach, fleets are approaching each other at sort of 3 to 5 knots, 5 knots maximum, maybe 3 knots, and you have time for decisions. Here,
mm,
the ships are approaching each other at sort of what, 22 to 24 knots
mm,
combined, and then the ranges are extended. You have the torpedo threat, and you have bad weather.
mm,
Very, very
mm,
difficult circumstances to
mm.
gain what you need to gain in very, very little time in the North Sea.
So we've got then sort of heavy British fire then on the head of the German fleet, and from my reading of the battle, there's ships are going in and out of visibility.
Yep.
Things aren't easy to see. I think there's some records. I think it might even be in the animation of gunnery commanders kind of saying, "I'm firing at somewhere over there,"
Even I think
actually doing quite well.
even the gunnery commander on Iron Duke was nervous
Mm,
of the initial opening fire because he thought they might be our own ships. As it
mm,
was, Iron Duke engaged Koenig, and in about 7 or 8 minutes landed 6 or 7 shots. I mean, her
Mm.
firing was superlative. But as you say, the conditions change from 22nd to 22nd. And even on the same ship, you'll have totally different interpretations of almost the same action coming from one person, maybe who is on the bar, another person who's in the stern, or, of the same action. They have utterly different interpretations.
So Shear then, what? How does he respond to the situation that he
Sheer,
finds himself in?
Sheer has actually anticipated the need to have a very, very quick
Mm.
turnaround, and effectively orders each ship to turn on its spot the moment that it sees the ship in front turning, so that it's not the sort of the it's not the maneuver that Beatty executed in the turn of the south going up to the north, or Evan Thomas did, where they all successively follow each other around the same part. It's each of them just turn. So one moment, you know, there's the fleet, the whole German fleet in front of him, and 4 minutes later, nothing. And I mean, there's a complaint that he doesn't get information from his captains, but I think that they're in the same position. They haven't seen, or they don't understand what's going on either. They see that they've been engaged, and then there's suddenly the enemy has disappeared. I mean, I suppose at this point, people sort of say, well, Jellicoe should have then turned towards them and given chase immediately. Not that the evidence from Tsushima and when the Japanese and Russian navies met each other is completely gives a complete clarification on this matter. But Jellicoe really was
Mm.
rather nervous of chasing an enemy sight unseen over waters that had not been
Mm.
cleared, because he really thought, wrongly, that mines would be dropped in the path of a pursuing enemy, and that he could just steer the Grand Fleet just straight over a minefield.
Mm.
It wasn't the case, but he was wrong on that.
I think that the threat of destroyers and torpedoes was also an issue because for a battleship or a battle cruiser, good visibility and long distance is your key weapon, and you can take out anything coming towards you quite comfortably before it gets anywhere near you. But if you reduce that visibility, you then become vulnerable. And is that also in Jellicoe's mind during this time?
I think he was always nervous of the torpedo threat, and again, we'll come on to this very much more specifically in the Turnaway. But he was. It's certainly the way that a weaker navy, defined in terms of ship size, would fight a bigger opponent. That you would use the fast maneuverability of torpedo boats to try and cause chaos in a battle line. That was certainly his feeling of what might happen in a night action where they hadn't trained for which they hadn't trained for specifically. It was certainly in his mind in the Turnaway. I think at this point of the battle, more in his mind was the mine threat, not so much the torpedo threat at this point. I think that's very qualitative. I don't have any sort of particular uh, data on which to back that up.
And for some, and I don't know whether you can help with this, but for some reason, then the German ships have kind of disappeared. But Shear then makes a turn back
Yeah, because he thinks
towards the main main
again,
fleet.
he can't see the extent of the British battle line, and I think he makes the calculation that he might be able to slip back to his northeast and
Mm.
creep in behind what he thinks is the last squadron. but he actually
Yeah.
goes back into not the center of the line, but certainly the last third of the line or something like that,
Mm.
and then it again receives the same battering and again has to turn around. But it was a gutsy move, um,
Mm.
and it was the sort of move that I don't think JRJ would ever have attempted.
Mm. Yeah, and from a when we've recreated the battle on a number of occasions, it's always the problem for the Germans once you get under the concentrated fire of a single line.
Mm.
You just can't survive it. It's just overwhelming because you've got so many more ships that you're kind of relying on luck to have multiple Queen Marys, if you like, to even the odds rather than having a an inverted commas fair fight. So I can certainly see because I think on that second one, is it right that some of the German captains turn away as individual ships just to the sheer weight of fire
Um, Gosh,
rather than an organised battle turn?
I think that happens more in the third turn.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
when the battle cruisers are sent in with some torpedo boats, but it's more or less it's. I'm trying to think
Mm.
what he called it. Um, there was a particular expression, but it's really run and find. It's really that and he's been beaten on the second attempt, and then he attempts one more time, but he sends in the battle cruisers specifically ahead this time and says, "Okay, you know what? Head to the enemy. You take the heat while we
Mm.
take the rest of the battle fleet out of the action." But the Rananfine was definitely there to sort of just as the only way that he could get his fleet out from under Jellicoe's guns.
At this time, it'd be nice to explore what Jellicoe's thoughts are on destroyers because when we looked earlier on at the weight of the forces, there are a lot more British destroyers involved. And did Jellicoe see destroyers as a defensive measure to prevent torpedo attack on his own fleet, rather than an offensive measure, which we subsequently see Shear using them as?
Yeah, I think so, and I think this is a sort of possibly an ideological division between Beatty and Jellicoe as well.
Mm,
Beatty, I think, Beatty's speciality, if I remember, was more as a torpedo man than a gunnery man.
yeah.
Um,
Mm,
and I think Beatty probably would have been more open to the same thing that was an allure to both Hipper and to Shear. That is the sort of the disruptive impact of using destroyers, because at the end of when the battle cruisers start turning north, the destroyers are sent across the battle lines actually just to try and do just that, and that's when Bingham is killed on Nestor and Nomad. And I think that Jellicoe's point of view is that the destroyers are really there much more to as the fleet's protection rather than as an offensive arm. This thing about the sort of the destroyers is quite interesting as it evolves through 1917, 1918 as well, because I think by 1917 the offensive power of the destroyer is actually seen in the wrong way. We have this sort
mm,
of picture of destroyers, the anti-submarine of destroyers, as we have in our minds for 1942, 1943, whereas in fact they had very little in the way of anti-submarine effect from the weapons they had, apart from just keeping them under the water so that so that they are away from their deck guns. But they certainly the depth charge was ineffective.
mm,
But I think your point is absolutely correct. I think that Jellicoe did see the destroyer's role as critical to the Grand Fleet's protection. And that's always his point of view. I think that, you know, for him, the Grand Fleet is the critical instrument of war. It's what keeps the 10th cruiser flotilla, if I'm saying that correctly. Yeah, 10th cruiser flotilla as the stopper in the north end of the North Sea. What guards them is the Grand Fleet. And the Grand Fleet's role is not necessarily one to go out and put itself at risk.
Mm.
It's there
Yeah.
to it's there to solidify and guarantee safety. Not so. Going back to this issue of offensive defensive, I think Jellicoe is much more on the defensive mindset in the defensive mindset than he is in offensive. And this may be sort of carrying through a sort of strategic outlook into a tactical outlook. I mean, certainly strategically, he was sort of saying, "What's to gain
Mm.
from over offensive tactics? Our role is to maintain the slow, quite unromantic, but effective strangulation of the German economy."
Yeah, I think, and I'm not just saying this because you're on the show, Nick, but um, I think,
Glad you're saying it.
yeah, I think that we've spoken about before. That steady, methodical
Mm,
method is what is required
mm,
here, because by splitting things off and going and attacking here, there, and everywhere, that is exactly what the Germans want. That their plan, as we spoke about before, is to pick off these little bits of the British fleet. So by keeping it together and defending the expensive bits,
mm.
is the perfect antithesis to that
Yeah,
German plan. So I think right person, right time.
it runs against everything though that is in the sort of the romanticism of the Nelsonian way and the
Yeah,
Nelsonian spirit. It's
I totally agree,
totally contrary.
and I think as a British nation, if we've got a fault, it's that romanticism of sometimes quite spectacular military failures.
Yeah,
Look at the charge of the Light Brigade,
Charles
for
Light
example.
Brigade, um, and I was thinking of Zeebrugge,
Yeah,
a slaughter and absolutely nothing gained, but nothing gained. And it was made into this, people praise it because they said this was a morale lifter and all the rest of it. Well, hell of a lot of people were lost lifting morale
yeah,
with nothing to show
yeah.
for it. So,
The British cavalry at Waterloo again, fantastic initial charge,
yep,
perfectly executed, and then they go off on a jolly
yep,
and effectively destroyed for the rest of the battle. So, as we like to say, they've got previous. So,
yeah,
I think in these circumstances, I think we've got the right guy in charge. So then we've got this. We've talked a little bit about it on a number of occasions. We've got this final German attack, which is kind of a death ride, basically, with Scheer prepared to sacrifice his light forces and his battle cruisers to get his main fleet away. By this time, the German battle cruisers have been through the run to the south, through the run to the north, through the fleet action. They must be
they've
on the last
sustained
legs.
serious damage. I think this is the moment, actually. I can't remember the precise moment, but this is the moment when Hipper says, "I can't use Lützow any longer as my flagship," and he transfers on the what is it, V-98 or something, takes them across to I think does he go across to Derflinger or to
Yeah, I'm not
I
sure.
can't I can't
Not
remember at
sure.
this point, but he you
Mm,
know not only is Lützow incredibly in bad condition, Derflinger's netting has all been shot away, and they has to sort of hack all the netting off because it's starting to sort of threaten the propellers. The ships are in very, very bad shape indeed. There's a famous photograph of Lützow Seydlitz actually, so low in the water that she's practically being washed on the bow. It's
yes.
incredible. Von der Tanner's lost just about all her guns. Derflinger too. Yeah, they've been through.
Yeah, that photograph that we were just talking about there is actually was proved quite useful for me because the white turret circles on the German
Mm,
ships, I painted them, and somebody came up and said, "Oh well, I think you'll find that they weren't on the German ships at Jutland." So I produced the picture of Sedlitz with the white
the
turret
way,
circle,
yeah.
and kind of went, "Do you think they've got something more important to do than paint a white circle on the top of that turret?" So
I
that
told
was
you
yeah,
at one point that I would talk about Derflinger and
mm.
Iron Duke. It's kind of interesting. Iron Duke was called the Tin Duck also,
Right.
and Derflinger. So you had Derflinger, the Iron Dog, and the Tin Duck.
Yeah.
And Derflinger was when she was up in Scapa, had been raised by Macram, Robert Crumb, in 1939. She was just been raised and was on her
Mm.
back, lying in the flow. And Iron Duke was beside her, decommissioned and sitting as a sort of gunnery ship. When Derflinger arrived in Rosyth, I think no, maybe I think it was Rosyth for stripping down. She arrived, and there's a picture of her arriving with Iron Duke in the background, already half stripped away. It's kind of sad to see the two of them meet a very inglorious end.
Yeah, because the American one thing the Americans are better at, and this may be because they've got considerably less history than we have, but they are
Mm.
very good at
Well, what they've
preserving
done to Texas has been incredible.
battleships. You know, I've been over to the
Um,
States, and yeah,
yeah,
yeah, it's amazing, and certainly, you know, Iron Duke would have been a candidate, Warspite
yeah,
especially, for us to have kept as a memorial. I would have
yeah.
liked to have seen that very much. So we're kind of at that the most talked about moment of the battle now, aren't we, Nick? We're at the moment of
I think we're past our 24 minutes as well. But
yeah,
okay,
exactly by a long way, and I have to say I do appreciate very much you taking all this time. I
no,
didn't
it's a pleasure.
dream that it was going to be this long, but thank you so much for taking the time.
I'm terrified that you're going to ask a whole slew of questions that I can't remember. Can't remember.
No, I've done my best questions, but uh, so this is the moment where the Germans are attacking with
Mm,
torpedoes, and
yeah,
Jellicoe makes the decision to turn away, and it's probably the one of the most
it's a very criticized
explored,
decision.
yeah, one of the most
Yeah,
explored, let's say explored
yeah,
rather than criticised
yeah.
decisions going on, and having I'm not suggesting by any stretch of the imagination that I'm historically recreating events, but I've been involved in situations in recreations from wargaming where this has happened, and the German torpedo attack has been successful, and on one occasion, sorry, Richard Jones, who was in charge of the British at the time, but my German destroyer attack was amazingly successful, and seven
Mm.
dreadnoughts were either badly damaged or sunk. Now, are we, or not we, but are people looking at this? And I know they are, with the benefit of hindsight of it not gone wrong, and how badly would Jellicoe have been castigated if he had that level of losses from this attack?
Um, no, I think it would have been removed from command
Yeah.
on the spot.
Yeah.
It's the turnaway for me is so exemplary of the ideology and the culture and the traditions of Nelsonia,
Mm,
Trafalgar, over influencing, I won't say decision making, over influencing the spirit within which one is fighting. And I sort of say the spirit because I think that from what I've read, very little in the literature actually covers the geometry, the problem facing Jellicoe. It's much more about the supporting the philosophy of not losing contact, pursuing the enemy, relentlessly carrying the attack forward. And I think, and I've never, I've tried to do it in some of the revisions of my book, because certainly for me, if one goes through the sort of the geometric representation and looks at the eventual turn away was, I don't know, what was it, 22 degrees or whatever it was, which was to line up the ships so that the torpedoes, by that point running at a very much reduced speed, would run either side of a retreating dreadnought. But if you take the exact opposite calculation of that 22 degrees to comb the tracks, as the expression was, and to run towards a torpedo, there are a number of things that run against you. One is that during that maneuver, you have to take a dreadnought from a beam profile of whatever it is, 90 feet, to a broadside profile of 650 or 600 feet. And so you present what Reginald Bacon looked at in his book as being sort of like a statistically unacceptable threat that you place in danger that you put your fleet in. Two, that running towards the torpedoes, the closing speeds obviously are magnified because you've got the combination of the dreadnought sailing towards, and even if it's on a diminishing run, the torpedo coming towards you. But the maneuverability of a dreadnought at that point is absolutely negligible. To come to, I can't remember, to come to a full stop from 20 knots requires a couple of nautical miles probably. And you're doing this in low visibility, so even if you see you might not see the torpedo. Added onto that was the mistake that Jellicoe made, was he thought that the Germans already had bubbleless torpedoes at this point.
Right.
They didn't until later on, but he was working under that assumption. So he thought, there are those things counting against it. And frankly, would turning towards the torpedo threat actually have retained contact with the main fleet? I think it probably would have put them more to the main high seas fleet stern. It probably would have taken them north of that. So I'm not sure that it would have actually necessarily maintained contact. But by the way, maintaining contact is the role of the battle cruisers.
Yeah.
Not necessarily the main fleet.
Yeah.
So I think, there are all those discussions saying, all those points sort of saying to take them towards, even as people like Andrew Gordon would suggest, even at the possible loss of a couple of dreadnoughts, incredibly risky proposition. Incredibly risky proposition when you are clearly facing a battle line that is disintegrating. The battle cruisers were heavily damaged, and even some of the major dreadnoughts were very badly damaged. So you're really reacting to a torpedo boat attack and falling, I think, sort of, trying to foil that with your major capital assets. I think it's very dangerous. Mind you, in this whole action, the disposition of I think some of the light cruisers was on the wrong side of the battle line, and so wasn't in a protective role as it should have been for the battle line, and that actually, I think, compounded the threat, because they wouldn't have been the targets that would have saved the dreadnoughts. Now, at the end of the day, I think something like 31 torpedoes actually made and passed through the British battle line, not one single one of them actually making contact. Marlborough had been hit earlier on
Earlier
by
on, yeah,
torpedoes,
yeah.
but they were extremely close. Some of these, I mean, coming within sort of 20 feet or something like that. I mean, very, very close indeed.
Yeah. I think 31's a lot, isn't it? You that
31's a
that
heck of a lot.
that if you've got your battle line broadside on at that particular moment in time, as you were
No,
saying, statistically, you're going to get
I
hit.
think it would have been extremely dangerous. But I never, and I really would be interested to see somebody do a very technical
Mm,
analysis of this. I mean, somebody like what was it, Campbell, who wrote the gunnery at Jutland, or John Brooks, who did technical analysis of gunnery. If they looked at this, I'd be really interested to see where they would come up,
mm,
because it needs that kind of geometric and engineering understanding that I don't have.
yeah.
But
And I think it's important to say that a lot of these people who have commented since have got the benefit of hindsight. They've got the benefit of being able to sit in their comfortable armchair with a glass of malt and think about
mm,
these things, whereas Jellicoe's got minutes. Maybe even less to make a decision that then has to be disseminated down this 5.5 mile line that we've spoken about, and then has to
mm.
be enacted. So, I think in your animation, it shows the various
Yeah, I
options.
try to. I'm not sure if I show it
Mm,
terribly successfully, because I'm not a great.
yeah, but
Doing the animation was costing a lot of money, and we
yeah,
were pretty stretched to
mm,
do what we did. But I think that it's at this point where one sort of says, okay, well, how do you judge the battle?
mm,
And do you judge it, how do you judge success? Or, was it a battle that the British won? Or should we even talk in those terms? I don't think so. I think that, the more one, going back to what you're saying about hindsight, the more that the horizon stretches from the event into consequences and outcomes that are further down the line, the more you understand the significance of the event, in which the actors are not necessarily comprehending what might occur and how their actions might change things. The great change of introducing the U-boat war was something that I don't think was foreseen necessarily. But also, I think that there's a sort of tendency to take the easy way out of looking at Jutland and purely look at it on a sort of very quantitative basis. Okay, number of men lost, number of ships lost. You know, look at the numbers. Well, the numbers are clearly not in the British favour. So I would sort of conclude from sort of things like that we're looking at elements within the chapters, in each of the chapters of Jutland. Some elements were outright defeats.
yeah,
The battle cruiser action was catastrophic. The night action wasn't laudable for lots of reasons, but the strategic impact is different.
yes,
And so I think our debate has become so driven by, gosh, I'm proud to be British, and I'll look at this through British rose tinted glasses, and I'd love the British to be the victors and all the rest. It's not about that any longer, I don't think. But it's very difficult pulling people away from that inclination to look at that battle in that way.
yeah. I think the context of the time as it later became is that we weren't we'd taken losses, but we weren't defeated to a point where the British fleet was no longer the power that it was. It
Mm.
was still a huge weapon, a huge power of which the Germans were scared of.
Yes, I mean, Scheer concluded that we could never. Scheer concluded and talked to the Kaiser, I don't know, a couple of weeks after, and sort of said, look, we're approaching this in the wrong way. The way that we can defeat the British is to defeat their economy. The way that we can defeat their economy is by unleashing super unrestricted submarine warfare. Let's not try to defeat them at their own game on the surface. They own the surface.
Mm,
We can actually switch the whole war's emphasis.
Yeah.
And um, it turned out to be a huge strategic miscalculation on the German side. But it was there were a lot of things within that made sort of sense. I mean, the miscalculation element is that they didn't understand the impact on the neutrals, America being the most important of them. But all of those sort of things come out, 50 to 100 years after Jutland. Even in I guess, when did Andrew Gordon write his book? In the mid 90s.
Mm.
You know, there were comments, I think, in the Sunday Times sort of saying, well, yeah, Jutland really wasn't a battle fleet action; it was a battle cruiser action. It's sort of remarkable,
Yeah.
uh, remarkably miopic view
Yeah.
of what actually happened.
Yeah, you have previous works like the analysis of the fighting at Jutland that you mentioned earlier on,
Exactly.
which
Yeah.
uh, uh, I've got to say it's not one of the most exciting reads I've ever had.
It's
Uh,
pretty turgid.
yeah, but for listeners, I'll put a link in the show notes for this particular book. But if you want to study the effect of gunnery in this period, it individually
Yeah.
recounts every single, and I'm not
Oh, I see.
joking here,
No, no, no,
every
no.
single shell hit.
It's the ultimate nerd book.
It's I kind of I
I
kind
mean,
of
I had to plow through that.
yeah,
I was obliged to, and it was like, oh God, got another 200
yeah,
pages to go.
I kind of remember reading through it and being fascinated by the first couple of shell hits, and then
Yeah, yeah, that
flicking
is.
forward and going, "There's going to be something else in a minute." Just
Oh no, it was appalling by the end.
but a fantastic source of information. Fantastic source of information. So we turn away. I've been the British. I know we this podcast is listened to all over the world, so I'm just showing me regional and country bias there. So we turn away and without loss, and it's then we're on to what's probably the least talked about part of the battle, and that's the night action, and that is effectively Shear trying to maneuver to get himself back to port whilst there's all sorts of chaos going on around him. I think you've mentioned it in certainly in the book and possibly in the animation that Jellicoe isn't particularly keen on a night battle. It takes away his advantages of numbers
Yep,
and
yep,
weaponry.
yep,
So
yep.
what's he thinking? What's he set up for in that night action?
Can I swing back?
Yeah, sure.
Just one thing to end off before the night action,
Mm,
and that is that the again, I'm sort of forgetting a lot of the detail, but there was one final chance for a re-engagement, and that is when Caroline actually went out of the line and
oh
attacked
yes,
the
yes.
German line and fired a torpedo, which ran true but too deep. And in the communications back, she was asking for support from the battle line, and that would have been a moment where the battle actually could have been the battle fleets
Yeah.
could have been re-engaged on a line to line in a line to line manner. It never happened because the particular admiral commanding the squadron didn't didn't buy in that Caroline had actually spotted the German fleet at all. So coming back to your question about the
Yeah.
night action, yeah, I think Jellicoe felt absolutely that it was night action was too much of a roll of the dice because he didn't have the sufficient technology, mainly in searchlight technology,
Mm,
or let's say illumination technology, either in star shell or in searchlights, to actually allow his ships to engage with a high confidence
mm,
with high confidence, and that in that scenario, chance just plays too high a role.
mm,
And so his last orders around 9 o'clock are: listen, close up in again in cruising formation so that we are acting as a sort of as a protective anti-submarine screen, I suppose. And we will behind us will follow almost 60 of our destroyers trying to maintain a screen on our rear to make sure that there's no rear attack. I think at that point he's sort of saying, well, okay, the battle will be re-engaged in the morning, and then there's a high confidence of having a full day in front of him that he could actually pull off a more militarily obvious victory. But within that, he has to decide where he thinks Scheer might head to. And Scheer has 3 or 4 alternatives. He could clearly head back up to the Skagerrak and head back around North Denmark into the Baltic. But knowing that some of his ships are very seriously damaged, he doubted that that would be an option because it would just take too long. He could run south to, I think, either the minefield gaps around Helgeland or Ems, or he could turn more directly to the German coast and try to head to the German coast. And I'm just trying to think exactly where the geography is. Again, my memory is sort of slightly bad on this. To the Horns Reef.
Yeah.
And it's the Horns Reef that actually Scheer decides on, rather than heading directly south to Wilhelmshaven, because the Horns Reef, Scheer can effectively hide his forces behind quite substantial minefields. Some people sort of say that when it becomes a little clearer that Scheer might have actually might be heading towards the Horns Reef, Jellicoe was actually very, very loath to make a major fleet redirection in the middle of the night.
Yeah,
just because it was
dangerous,
just too risky.
Yeah, dangerous.
I mean, John Brooks argues that, and I think, sure, it makes sense. But as his ships, paralleled by the battle cruisers, are heading south to what he believes would be the ultimate destination, Scheer's task is to break through that line at what he thinks is the weakest point. What is so unfortunate in retrospect here is that there was quite a lot of intelligence, raw intelligence, coming through from Room 40, the Admiralty Decipher Center in the old Admiralty building, that would suggest that would have suggested that the Horns Reef was exactly where Scheer was going. There were instructions to the airships to reconnoiter the area. There were instructions for some of the torpedo boat assets to make a run specifically there. Jellicoe had sent one ship, I think it was Abdiel, which was a fast mine layer, to lay mines across that path. It actually did strike a target, but a couple of days later, if I remember correctly. But he didn't think it was going to go there. His bet was that it was going to go south. It's interesting, though, again, in sort of the way that this history has been written, that this information from Room 40 didn't come out until at least 1940, 1939, I think it was, just before the First World War, and even now is still being sort of reinterpreted and reinterpreted. There's been some very interesting writings by, and actually an American Lieutenant Commander Hines, I think, who works with Epkenhans at the German Military Research Center. And his conclusion was that Room 40 was caught in this sort of Coventry-like decision, where if it released information that was too obviously collected from deciphering signals,
and we've given it away.
The Germans would get onto that and change their codes. So Room 40 was always working under the rule that they would have to have other corroborating evidence and to be able to mix that into a signal back to the fleet so that if intercepted, the Germans would think it came from either land sources or Hugh Mint or something like that. But the net effect of it was, as JRJ sort of said in the early 30s, that, had I known any of this, clearly I would have made some rather different decisions.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think the full extent of that information was published until the second round of official histories just before the Second World War. But he was certainly getting a wind of that before he died in 1935.
And I think a lot of that night action is revolving around this lack of communication that we've discussed earlier on. I think that
Even between the ships at sea,
yeah, there's a number of
nothing going on.
actions that happen. I
Yep.
think the brunt of the actions are from the destroyers, and that just isn't feeding back to Jellicoe on the Iron Duke. So he's not got that information on which to make decisions.
Yeah, and I think, there again, you can point the finger at him and saying, well, you may not have succeeded in getting this message through to Beatty because of the kind of character that Beatty was, but you should certainly have I would have thought, been able to get this message through to the destroyer captains to say, listen, this is a critical role. It's more important sometimes than how you fight. The intelligence you take back can be absolutely determinant. And not only did the intelligence not come back from the various individual flotilla engagements, of which there were many, and they were totally chaotic. British destroyers ramming other British destroyers, mistaking, friendly. There's a lot of friendly fire, just plain not understanding who was in front of them or what was actually happening. But as capital ships were passing through, within, I won't say sight, but within recognizably ambiguous shadowing in the night, that could have easily been interpreted as being, no, this is a capital ship. We don't know who it is, but report the sighting now. None of that went through. So, at I think sort of close to 3 o'clock, as at that time of year daylight is starting to come back up in the North Sea, the seas were empty. Scheer had managed to break through. He'd lost some ships. I think Southampton successfully torpedoed one. Some ships had been lost to self-ramming. Posen, I think, was one. It was so muddled, as I mentioned right at the beginning. There was this episode of one destroyer Spitfire colliding with a 20,000-ton dreadnought. But none of this got back.
Yeah.
And so, reluctantly, JRJ towards 3 o'clock in the morning said, well, they're back in port. We've lost the contact. We've lost the possibility of continuing battle. I mean, an American journalist commented, well, we're still locked in jail, and the jailer's thrown away the key. So, who owns the battlefield owns the battlefield. But it's not territorial in that sense. It's more that, they just narrowly escaped. Lützow had to be scuttled.
Yeah.
And that in itself is a terrible story of a terrible human story of a small crew staying on the Lützow, keeping the generators going so that their other comrades could get off the ship before she was torpedoed. These men knew that they would die. And that is, that's the sort of, one can't kind of glorify any of this.
No, it's an immense story of, personal bravery that should be remembered.
It is. And these ships were so badly damaged that, I think I can't remember if it was Seidlitz, I think, she was taken backwards into harbor. Some of the guns had to be taken off because, she was just sinking. She was dragging the bottom. she couldn't get back. So the losses, you know, even on the losses, one has to look at the losses in a different way. One has to look at, okay, well, how significant were the losses within the total complement of the Navy? Much more significant for the
Germans,
Germans
yeah.
than for us. The dock days and repair days were much longer as well. So the force wasn't ready to take part in any renewed action, unlike the Grand Fleet that was ready to go back to sea, within hours. I think probably 4 or 5 hours after it had recoaled in Scapa.
It's that percentage, isn't it? Like you say, 3 ships from 20 is a lot bigger
Yeah.
percentage than 3 ships from 30. So
Yep.
it really
Yeah.
hasn't affected our fighting capability. Though the loss of those crew was obviously tragic in its own right. It's not affected the fighting force of the Royal Navy. We'll draw a line there under the battle itself. And are you all right, Nick, to talk a little bit more?
I'm fine.
Are you
I'm fine.
sure?
I'm fine. My wife hasn't yet come and sort of hassled me to go out and help in the garden. So I may
Brilliant.
be getting off light.
Excellent. That's what I like to hear. Because I'd just like to quickly, if we can do quickly, um, just kind of cover the aftermath if we could, and just talk about
Sure.
what happened to John after the battle,
Yeah.
and we talked a little bit about the U-boat thing as well. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're back, and this is heading on for the longest podcast I've ever done. And again, I can't thank you enough, Nick. It really is
Pleasure.
grateful of you to take up this amount of time with us. So I didn't want to kind of end it where we did because it's kind of floating. Is that
Mm,
the right word?
mm,
In the ether. I wanted to kind of see what happened to the characters that we've got invested
yeah.
in over the last few hours. I think the first thing to say, and we've talked a little bit about this all the way through, is that we're over 100 years over now, 108 years, aren't we? And we're still talking about it.
Sure.
It's it's a fascinating topic, and we're still analysing, and we're still discussing as we are now this battle that happened so long ago. It's part of British naval history.
I think it is. I mean, I think, when we headed towards 2016, I was very worried that Jutland would not receive the recognition, or that the discussion around Jutland wouldn't be as deep as it should be.
Mm,
And certainly it was sort of easier in the school's curriculum to take students to battlefields. It was that didn't happen with any of the naval battles. No kids were
mm,
taken out in a ship and
yeah.
taken across the sea.
The risk assessment for that primary school visit would be an
Exactly.
interesting one.
So I was nervous that Jutland would kind of get lost between Gallipoli and Verdun and the Somme, but in fact it didn't. But we started knocking on doors. I remember my first meetings with the National Maritime Museum and the National Museum of the Royal Navy were
Mm,
in, I think, June 2011.
right, so lots of
And I
time.
said, and I sort of said, look, I really want to be part of this discussion, and I really want to be and contribute to it. Plus, I want to ask your help in supporting
Mm,
some of my efforts. And I said, look, my efforts are going to be built very much around communication to a new generation. Um, People have, you go into museums and it's like one dusty exhibit under glass after the other.
yeah.
And so, think about putting animations in the
Mm,
museums or videos to sort of
mm,
explain what it is. At first, sort of the reaction was pretty muted, and then actually, both the NMM and NMRN came in and helped fund it. And actually, when the when the National Maritime Museum opened its exhibit, just before the Duke of Edinburgh went around, and because there'd obviously been sort of family connections serving at Jutland, he took a special interest. They had planned to sort of whisk him around the exhibition in 10 minutes,
Yeah.
where he was stuck watching the animation
Oh,
for
brilliant.
24 minutes. He wouldn't budge. He said, no, no, no. And that was the same thing in the German museums.
Yeah.
We did a German translation. And what was so gratifying was to see older men, obviously with children, or in this case, probably even grandchildren, both absolutely, I won't say mesmerized, but really paying attention.
Yeah.
So, to take the communication of the story out of print and put it into digital, whether it's animation or documentaries or something else, I think was very, very important. And then there was an effort to get the museums to actually cooperate and work together in partnership, because, as I say, we have a tendency always to sort of to I went to commemorate, but almost celebrate rather than commemorate, and with more gravitas. It's better that we look at the same story from two eyes and two perspectives, even if we disagree. In the disagreement, there's actually great value in understanding why there's that disagreement. And so I work very closely with the German Naval Museum at Wilhelmshaven, whose director very sadly, age 53, died 4 weeks ago. But he and I cooperated very, very closely, and we took same exhibits from Germany, and we put them in Denmark, and we then took some over to the UK as well, and really mixed them around so the artifacts were not only British, but they were also German and being shared. I'd hoped that we could actually create a core exhibition that we could have used for the smaller museums who couldn't afford the materials that the larger museums might more philanthropically actually donate. And so, that was the hope. Unfortunately, I think in that world, it's a rather forlorn hope.
Yeah.
So some of that worked, some of it didn't. But, we were able to do, I think we were able to substantially impact the debate. I mean, for a website that I created by myself, Jutland1916.com, which you kindly mentioned, 5,500 people went to that on May the 31st, 2016. I know, for a small website with nothing behind it. I mean, that in itself just exhibited how large the interest was. I found it disturbing, though, that in some ways it worked out very well, but at the time I was very disturbed that the government had taken the decision that Jutland was going to be it was going to be a national commemoration. It was going to be held in Kirkwall in Scapa. Not only that, but also that the German and British governments hadn't actually decided between them when should be the German commemoration, when should be the British.
Yeah.
Because both of you choosing the 31st of May or the first is not particularly helpful. It would have been better almost to have chosen the evening of maybe the morning of the 31st or the evening of the 30th for the departure of the Grand Fleet, and the morning of the 1st for the return of the High Seas Fleet, so that there could be more interchange between British and Germans to commemorate and be present on each celebration. And I certainly tried to do that, but it was impossible for journalists to get from Kirkwall to Germany. But we did nevertheless manage to, I think, build a very significant outreach to the Germans to say that this is a history we must look at more closely together. As I say, I was given extraordinary access. I mean, really extraordinary access when I was there, and I was even invited to the German Naval Academy in Murvik, on the Danish border, and was asked by the admiral, would I present half of the class's graduating certificates?
Oh, wow.
So I went one line. I mean, that was huge honor.
Wow, that's
And then we
fantastic.
had, exchanges between HMS Duncan and Brandenburg, and we
Mm,
went to the services in Wilhelmshaven. And the service at sea was eventually Brandenburg and Duncan
mm,
and Iron Duke. But even weeks before that, months before that, we weren't sure that Iron Duke was even going to be able to be
mm,
there because, she might have NATO obligations. But the service was done in partnership with the German Navy, and they lined the stern of Duncan as the wreaths were thrown into the sea. German sailor, British, German sailor, British. In the Isle of Wight, sitting up in a sort of dusty corner, was Iron Duke's Jack. It had
oh,
been sitting there since it
yeah.
had been donated by the Admiral in the early
Mm,
30s. And they kindly agreed that the
mm.
Jack could go with Duncan.
Oh, fantastic.
And she was on Duncan. And
Mm.
then Frederick Dreyer's grandson gave me Iron Duke's battle ensign.
Oh,
So both
wow.
her battle ensign and Jack went up on Duncan and were raised over Jutland Bank as she's steamed. Okay, every museum curator
It's
was sort of
shaking.
rolling in their grave. But I honestly felt, what's the point of having something that is so deeply symbolic
Yes.
that doesn't have an active role in this commemoration? It's got to. And I was so glad we did that, although it was kind of a slightly terrifying moment. And that flag now has gone back up to Scapa and is in the new visitor centre. So it's gone home in a way.
That flag now has a new story, doesn't it? That flag is kind of living, if
Yeah,
you like.
absolutely.
It
It has a new life. I
yeah.
mean, I'm very, very glad
Mm,
that it's there. I really am. And I got, as I say, got very much more involved with
mm,
Scapa when I was writing the book on the scuttling of the German fleet.
mm,
But I think that certainly from my point of view, you know, Jutland and my role in it, opened up so many things to me. It opened up
mm,
a whole new relationships with, sort of say, the U.S. Naval War College, where I went and talked. I talked to the War College alumni in Germany, went and lectured at the academy in Annapolis. I didn't go to the graduate school in California, although I would have
mm.
liked to, because I lived in the States. And I think there, the more serious questions about Jutland could have been asked, because frankly, at Annapolis, all the midshippies, all the midship were kind of dying to get through the lecture and just go and have a beer. So they weren't terribly interested or engaged. Who is this limey who's come
Yeah.
over to talk to us? Um, but because of that, it's led to, I think, a sort of a much longer cooperation on some other
Mm,
subjects. So submarine war is what I got into next, and that's really because of what I had started to read about the submarine war as a consequence of Jutland, and so I decided rather ambitiously that I would write about JRJ's role as First Sea Lord in the submarine war and his role a little bit as an admiral. Turned out to be actually a lot more complex than I thought it would be. But it's finished. It's with the publishers. I hope it comes out this summer,
excellent.
and we'll see.
I'm looking forward to
It
that.
might be as turgid as Campbell's book on gunnery.
No, I don't think that's possible, Nick. I really don't think that's possible.
It might be.
That's a challenge that I wouldn't set anyone.
Yeah.
Bless him. I don't know whether is he still around, Campbell? I don't know. But
I don't think so.
no.
Don't think so.
Well, I don't mean to,
Maybe maligning him, but
yeah, I don't mean to speak ill of the
um,
dead, but really, that's one of the most boring books I've ever read. It really was. It really was. Um,
yeah,
so let's just finish the story of John Jellicoe off then. So Jutland is over, and
yeah,
it kind of the Germans big it up, don't they, as a massive victory in the death of the British Navy, and
yep,
it's
sure.
it's a big propaganda thing for them. Whereas back in the UK, we're
But
kind of
Germans had advantage. They got back to base more quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, the German story was hitting the Reuters lines before the British fleet was even back in Scapa. So it created immediately this sense in Britain that a big defeat had happened. And so not only was there disappointment, but there was outright anger and really kind of very vitriolic behavior when the battle cruisers returned, for example, to Rosyth, and people were up on the railway bridge lobbing coal down at the sailors, and even sailors were spat at. The story had been so badly managed. There was no communication management. Why did that happen? Well, unfortunately, the Admiralty used JRJ's literal official, what he thought was an internal report, almost as a basis to write a news story.
Mm.
And it took 4 or 5 communiques just to try and get the information correct at that point. And then finally they decided that, Churchill as a formal correspondent should actually write for the Sunday papers to try and put the British perspective on. So it took a full week for the real story to come out. And even so, it may have come out in a more blended way in a week.
Mm.
But the story, as you say, is still incredibly controversial 100 years later.
Yeah.
And has gone through these, one decade is incredibly anti, another decade it turns away. I think the 90s was still quite anti-Jellicoe.
Mm.
I feel that in sort of 2010 and around the Jutland centenary, actually it got to be a much richer discussion of much more fundamental issues. I personally feel, though, that this is incredibly politically incorrect of me to say, but I think that the Royal Navy missed an opportunity here, because Jutland in some ways was the perfect moment to talk about, the Navy's role in the island's defence and the fundamental importance of British maritime power.
Yeah.
What it means to trade protection, what it means for the culture of the country. I mean, we're living in an age of just-in-time manufacturing, just-in-time delivery, and any single glitch, whether it's Suez Canal being blocked by a cargo ship or what's going on now with Houthis, any of these glitches, or Baltimore, have incredibly significant impact very quickly. And I think that Jutland was the perfect opportunity for the Royal Navy to hang its story on that pin, disregarding whether Jutland was successful or not successful, but its strategic context and the strategic questions that it posed. That's really where the debate should have been. There was still quite a lot of remaining vitriol in the air, and it didn't help. And I joked about this earlier on, but as much as I loved him as a man, Eric Grove's initial opening comments in the documentary were about Beatty forging his signature on the famous, double circle of the battle cruisers at one point in the battle. It didn't help, because the last thing that I wanted, the last thing that my father had wanted, was this continuing animosity or coolness between the two families. It shouldn't be. It's not where the debate is. It's really unimportant, actually, in the debate. But unfortunately, it really did not help that coming out. The night before, we had brought together as many of the descendants, Germans included, to a service at St. Paul's in Nelson's Crypt, where Beatty and Jellicoe lie side by side, much to my grandmother's disdain. And following that, we had a lunch at the Army and Navy, and then we went to Trafalgar Square, and Kipling's poem was read by my daughter, as were some other things by the great-grandchildren. So the grandchildren, myself, took most of the lead in the St Paul's services and the great grandchildren at Trafalgar Square. And Trafalgar Square, we made part of the film documentary there, right in the middle between the fountains. The two fountains were one's dedicated to Beatty, one's dedicated to JRJ. But if you think about it, and what I was sort of talking to, I guess, the successors of Greater London Council
Mm.
about, was this is the centre of our expression of what British maritime heritage and power means. But we have three admirals, ABC, Beatty, Jellicoe, and Nelson, and then we have expressions of modern art or God knows what. But it's got nothing to. There's no single statue to Jackie Fisher that I know of in London, or Craddock, or Frobisher, the great explorers of sort of the age of exploration. And I think this is wrong. We seem to be, people use the expression sort of sea blindness, but I see it as being very strongly manifested in
Mm.
these kind of situations, because there's between the two statues there's a brass plaque on the ground. Nobody notices it. And the brass plaque is who these fountains were dedicated to and what it's about.
Yeah.
It's not that one has to make a great show of it, but maybe if you have a brass plaque and if it's supposed to be a memorial, then maybe it's a good idea that actually it feels like it's there to be noticed rather than just to be walked across. There were many occasions, I think there are many occasions like this where we forget our history at our peril. We really, really do. I mean, the size of our navy now is sort of pitiful
Mm.
in terms of what it should be.
And at least we've got aircraft carriers now, because before we had those, we had very little what we call power projection.
Yeah,
But you're right; it's a dangerous road to go down.
I wish we'd get the engineering right. It's kind of embarrassing when we have propeller shaft problems
Yeah.
and Duncan and on the aircraft carriers. Because it's becoming a very serious time again,
Mm.
and not sort of over exaggerated or be dramatic about it, but I think we need to be have a heck of a lot more sense of urgency on these issues right now than we did 4 years ago, 5 years ago.
Yeah, I think I'm in total agreement with you that we need to make sure that we preserve our history and keep banging on
Mm.
about it, which is what we're doing now, in
Yeah,
our
exactly.
in our own little way,
Yeah,
to make sure that these stories aren't forgotten. And your points you made there about Trafalgar are perfectly valid, and that what a fantastic place to have more statues of British naval heroes, if you want to call them heroes.
yeah.
Uh,
Maritime and naval,
yeah,
they
that
should be there.
that would make a fantastic
Raleigh and
change.
Rodney and
Mm,
Frobisher and all the rest.
yeah, exactly,
Um,
exactly. So we've talked quite a lot through the podcast about the next step in the first Sea Lord, and this development of a response to the Germans react to Jutland by going to submarines, unrestricted submarine warfare, and again in your animation, which is 24 minutes long, folks, not 4 hours like this is. There's that picture, isn't there, of the tonnage losses once the Germans start
yeah,
concentrating on it, and
yeah,
and
yeah.
Jellicoe is fundamental in the changes in the British Navy to reacting to that. I think he develops the convoy system, and he's so
It's
involved.
the convoy system, though, is the point on which he's very, very criticised. I think that here again, his meticulous hesitancy, his meticulous analysis, actually got in the way of this sense of urgency we were talking about. Because I think what Lloyd George was really looking for was somebody who was going to attack this problem with passion and conviction.
Mm,
And Jellicoe, unfortunately, by this point, maybe he was just very, very tired, but I think he was
mm,
actually just being a realist. he was saying, gentlemen, you're talking about spring offensives. I'm not sure that this country can actually get through and survive until the spring. You do not understand how serious this problem is. And I think, he was largely correct that a lot of the war cabinet did not understand how serious the problem was. But Jellicoe went into that position accepting it from Asquith, who was replaced by Lloyd George pretty well the same week as JRJ stepped into the position at Admiralty officially. And his head of PR, it wasn't exactly head of PR, but he sort of posed in the question and says, look, I know you're not getting great publicity at the moment. Is there anything I can do to help? And JRJ's response, this is the first week that he's in at the Admiralty, was, personally, I don't have time to read the papers. Secondly, I'm not going to be in this job more than a year anyway. I'll guarantee it. he saw that it was it was going to be a murderously difficult job, and so it was. I think on the question of convoy, I think where Jellicoe put into motion the production of many of the elements that were needed in the portfolio of anti-submarine warfare. British mines were next to hopeless. Only one third of them exploded on contact. So in the end, we copied the German Horn mine, and things like the Q ships worked very well right at the beginning, and were quite effective, but had the, I think, unforeseen effect that actually they encouraged the onset of unrestricted submarine warfare and sinkings without warning, because no submarine wanted to be tempted in, lured in to be treated in that way or attacked in that way. So I think it was a sort of unforeseen circumstance. Air power was belittled, but it was never really given the chance to be what it could be. What wasn't understood was the importance of air power as being the reconnaissance that brought surface ships to action. The barrage is incredibly expensive and not really effective in themselves until the mines were effective. Once the mines were effective, then the barrages became effective. So Bacon, who was commander of the Dover Patrol, was highly criticized for much of this, but he didn't have the right weapons at his disposal. Jellicoe is, I think, quite unfairly criticized here for being opposed to convoy. I think he wasn't the immediate supporter and the most vocal of supporters for convoy, and politically that was incorrect. He did it. He took his time because he said, "Listen, without adequate destroyer escort, convoy it's not only not going to work, it actually could be more dangerous. If we group ships together in convoy and then don't protect them, actually this will just encourage attack." They were absolutely wrong on this idea, though, that convoy grouped potential targets in a smaller zone of visibility, and that smaller zone of visibility effectively cleared a lot of the seas from rich targeting by German submarines. And Dönitz himself talks about this sort of this dramatic effect. They didn't understand that. They didn't do the statistical work that was quite actually obvious in retrospect, not obvious at the time. At the right legal status, both sides of the Atlantic, armed ships could not be in American ports unless they were the status of belligerency was accorded by Congress. With the declaration of war, America came into war against Germany, not against Austro-Hungary, but against Germany. And at that point, we could set up the corresponding logistical network that was needed on the American side of the Atlantic. But more importantly, the convoy needed a degree of nationalization and national control of maritime resources that was almost socialist at this point, and certainly was opposed to by a lot of the ship owners. A lot of the ship owners were not necessarily in favor of convoy itself because they saw it as cutting into profits and time and being told what to do by a party that they were not necessarily agreed with. But it did require, all these sort of resources. It required the coordination of rail and transportation systems at the receiving and sending end. It required naval coordination of handover of convoys, mid-Atlantic or outside of the submarine zone, which was about 300 miles offshore. It was a lot more than just gathering ships together and providing an escort stream. So that's the first thing. Secondly, I think that we have a very short time span on this. The first successful real trial of convoy on a large scale were sorry, I'm just blanking on the name, but
Yeah.
were the Gibraltar convoys in
Yeah.
June 1917, and from June through to the early autumn, convoys rolled out. That's not actually a very protracted timetable
No, it's very
for
quick.
how immense the issue was.
Mm.
So I think, what one can say is John Jellicoe probably, dragged his feet overly by being overcautious, being over analytical, trying to understand what elements of the portfolio of anti-submarine warfare really work well together, which ones need to be revised, what new weapons platforms had to be developed. But he spent a little bit too much time on that. And maybe he should be, I think, evaluated more in terms of an implementation of convoy. And it's quite significant that even in 1918, the idea of using destroyers as hunters, going back to this idea of the offensive, started to come back on the table again. So what had been seen as being was again under question within 1 year.
Unfortunately, at this point, we lost communication, and although Nick was recording things at his end, I wasn't able to stitch it back together. So, unfortunately, that's kind of the end of the little chat we were having on the Destroyer War post Jutland. And then we moved on to talk about John Jellicoe and his life after Jutland. And we were talking about him being High Commissioner for New Zealand. And that's where we drop into the next part of the conversation. So apologies for that, but best way I could join them together. Unfortunately, the gap was too big for me to do normal editing processes. So back to the interview now.
New Zealand in 1920 and stayed there for 4 years. I mean, in many ways, I think those were some of the happiest years of his life because he was kind of out of all the kind of shenanigans and parliamentary questions and all the rest of it that was going on with the Harper Report. Even if he was having to sort of answer some of them without any staff based in New Zealand, at least he was in New Zealand with his family. I'm actually going to be going to New Zealand later on this year because it's the centenary of his leaving. I tried to go in 2020 and, of course, had to cancel everything because of COVID. But I like to sort of, just acknowledge the legacy that he has there. I mean, New Zealand, lost a lot of people in the First World War. And a lot of his duties at the time were to kind of acknowledge that, take care of that, look after the veterans, and make sure that there was a sort of a good as good a support that was possible for them. At the same time, though, he was also asked to look at the imperial structure of the imperial structure, naval structure. So he looked at, I think, the naval support in Canada, from Australia and New Zealand, and was very, very instrumental in the initial thinking of the building of the Singapore naval base, which then got delayed and I think cut back somewhat by Geddes, trying to cut back naval budgets. But so his activities really, range that gamut from a sort of civilian governor general to a sort of naval officer without portfolio, going around the empire and making sure that this planning was getting into the sort of strategy tank, if you will.
And did he retire? Did he come home and kind of stop working, or did he just carry on?
He interestingly enough, when Earl Haig died, he was asked to take over the British Legion. And at first he kind of said, no, look, more men were lost in the trenches than on ships. It really should be somebody who is from the army. And they insisted on him as being their replacement. He was actually a very, very successful president of the Legion. And there's some very lovely stories about him. Typically JRJ, he would never travel at Legion expense on first class. So he would always go to the third class carriage on a railway station. And usually the station masters would come out, kind of beg him to go forward, ride in first class. He was a lovely character in that way. He got, I think, then very, very close family life. His wife, Gwendolyn, was considerably younger than he was, and she died, I think, in 1964, something like that. So just 2 years before the 50th anniversary. He spent a lot of time on the Isle of Wight. He had a house near Ventnor, and unfortunately, I think he bequeathed it to one of his daughters, and then they didn't want to live there, and it burnt down. And so all that's left is now, the estate gates, what was the coach house, one of the cottages, and the land beside the cottage is now being turned into a vineyard by the present occupant, who I went on doors, and then she in, and she gave me copies of all the original kind of sales brochures and what have you. It was really lovely. So Ventnor in the Isle of Wight, I used to spend quite a bit of time over there, just trying to sort of, pick up family roots and what have you. I suppose, for me, having done the book on Jutland and then the book on the submarine war, I feel as I've kind of done my bit. On First World War naval history. And so now I'm just trying to sort of, write on very different subjects, as I mentioned right at the beginning. And that's kind of equally fascinating. I probably will get back into something naval in a couple of years if I make it that far.
Well, I think you mentioned earlier on that John is buried in Westminster Abbey with Nelson and Beatty.
And his wife. Gwendolyn's.
And his wife.
I don't think Ethel is with Beatty, but Gwendolyn is beside him.
And when you look around the people in that in that place, it's a great honor, isn't it, for him to be laid to rest there. And I'd just like to say, just from a daft bloke in Yorkshire, that you should be very proud of what you've done for your grandfather. You've really brought to life his history, and through the 2016 commemorations and all the stuff you've done, you've brought forward that period of history, and I think it's fantastic what you've done.
It's been, honestly, as I say, for me, it's been a really kind of really nice journey to have been on. And I've met
Mm.
so many people through this that have become great friends as a result of
Yeah.
it. And it's lovely to sort of be able to share, have the sort of shared interest that one can, talk on for hours as we have.
Yes, we have.
And what did we say? We'd planned for 2 hours, but maybe if it falls short, falls short.
Yeah.
We really made our couple of hours worth.
Yeah. So, thank you once again for all your time today,
It's
Nick.
been a pleasure. It really has. And I hope
And
we'll do it some other time when I decide to write another naval book sometime.
yeah, well, when your destroyer convoy book comes out, maybe we'll have another chat
Brilliant.
then. That
Yeah.
would be interesting to go through that. I always get people to say good night to our audience when we go. So good night,
Probably
everyone.
good morning right now
It probably
after
is
the
by the
hours we've been talking. It's been a great pleasure. I really have enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
There we go, everyone. I have to say, I really enjoyed that interview with Nick Jellicoe. So grateful to him for taking up so much of his time, and he was a wonderful person to talk to. And I learnt so much about a battle that I have studied for so many years. And I've got to say, I'm really proud of this episode. I think I've come a long, long way from episode one in learning about interviewing people and listening to people and how to do these podcasts. And I think if this was the last one I ever did, and don't worry, it won't be, but if it was, I could quite happily say, yeah, I've gone out on a high, and I'm really, really, as I say, proud of this episode. So I hope you've enjoyed it. I know it's a long one. I know it's about a topic that might not be particularly popular within war game circles, but for the history aspect of it as well, I really enjoyed that as well. So fingers crossed, I'll get to do some more historical based podcasts in the future, and hopefully Nick will come back on, as we said, when his Destroyer War book comes out later in the year. So that just leaves me to say that my next episode will be with Joe Bilton, and Joe, better known probably as Joe the Wargamer on Twitter, and Joe is without doubt one of the best terrain makers in the world of wargaming at the moment. And if you went to Salute, I'm sure you will have seen his really big salute table in the Lardy zone, which was I got a chance to bob over and scan it over for 2 minutes, but there was so much detail on it, and he'd done a Normandy one the year before that was equally as brilliant. So I struggle with my terrain, as regular listeners will know, in terms of both enthusiasm and skill. So it's going to be great to talk to Joe about terrain and his gaming in general, and his involvement with the Lard Zone. And he does one of the Lardy days, Hearts of Lard, as well. So I'm looking forward to that. It might be 3 weeks or so before I get that out. I just want to take a little bit of a break with me having so many so close together, and I've had a 2 week release schedule for the last eight weeks. So I'm just going to take a little bit of a break, maybe a couple of weeks, and then I should be back with Joe. So until then, have a cracking time with your wargaming. Really enjoy it, and if you're down at parties on the 19th of May, come down and see me. I will have my Mentana game out, and it'd be lovely to chat to people who enjoy this show. So until next time, Siddy.